everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of ArkTalks. And we are covering the incredibly important topic this time of the SEND Green Paper and what it might mean for SEND and provision in England after in the future. And I am extremely lucky to have with me an extremely distinguished panel to discuss this with, and we are going to have. I am just making sure I have the right information about who is speaking with us today. So we have Simon Knight, who is head teacher at Frank Wise School, and I'm just making sure I have everyone's details. Sorry, I had this up beforehand and it all closed. So I'm just making sure I have it now. You know what, rather than do that, I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves properly, and then we're going to have a discussion afterwards. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go around each of our panelists, and I'm going to ask them to do 5 to 10 minutes, just setting out their initial response to the SEND Green Paper. And then we're going to go into questions. I will ask some questions. And then I'm going to hope that everyone will put some questions in the chat. We can't see you on the recording, but we can see your questions. So please put them into the chat, and we will take it from there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves properly. We've got Simon Knight, head teacher at Frank Wise School. We have Tanya Tiraro, who is the co-founder of Special Needs Jungle, which is one of the most valuable and important resources for anyone who is interested in understanding SEND, and I'm sure most people on this call have used it, and Daniel Upfield, who is an Ark principal at Ark Swift. So we're going to go to each of them in turn, but I'm going to start with Simon.
Thanks, Sam. So my name's Simon Knight. I'm joint head teacher at Frank Wise School, which is a 2 to 19 SLD PMLD school in North Oxfordshire. And what I'll be talking about in terms of the SEND review in a little while is very much characterised by the children that I work with who have severe or profound and multiple learning disabilities. And one of the key things for me is how we take that journey beyond statutory services, and actually how we look at disaggregating children within the context of that broad SEND label and recognising them as unique individuals in their own right. Sam, are you going to go person to person first, or do you want me to do my little 5 minutes and then?
If you do your 5 minutes, and then we'll go person to person.
Perfect. Okay. So for me, the emphasis of SEND review is a bit too much on system reform rather than being driven by a broader social intent. I'm also concerned that the reforms are motivated too much by fiscal control rather than securing the best outcomes for children and their families. There's a clear and understanding emphasis on procedural efficiency, equity and effectiveness, all of which, for me as a special school head teacher, are critical. And broadly, they've identified the right areas to focus on in terms of making the within-service experience a better one. So, for example, the current capacity in the specialist sector is woefully misaligned with the requirements of the communities that we serve. And our collective understanding as a sector, so from DFE right down to local area and even to schools to some extent, of national capacity requirements and the effectiveness of our response to them is insufficient. The DFE's own data shows that the state-funded special school headcount has increased by nearly 29,000 children since 2015-16. That's about 27%. And at the same time, the number of schools has only increased by 32. There's a little bit more to it than that. There's sort of headline figures, but that would show a quite significant, disconnect between the creation of additional schools in terms of meeting the capacity need compared to the additional children that we see within the system. So special schools are full, and there is very little in the way of strategic planning to address this. It's one thing to announce the investment; it is another to deliver the places in an efficient and accurately targeted manner. And after all, 30% of the special free schools in the pipeline have been in pre-opening for more than 4 years. So it would suggest it's not a particularly nimble response in terms of policy. So if we're to build greater localism of decision-making, provide local areas of greater influence, if a local inclusion plan is to be successful, it will need to be nimble and imaginative and supported with funding, or it will just be a toothless aspiration. And what we can't risk is creating something as ineffective and often impenetrable as the local offer. This has got to be a meaningful response, driven by local context and funded sufficiently in order that it can meet local need. The Green Paper is also right to focus on the variability of funding for schools serving comparable levels of complexity, addressing the current postcode lottery of opportunity that variable finance creates. For example, our school receives a top of about £8,000 per pupil, compared to a national average of £12,000 for a school of our type. That equates to about £500,000 per year below national average for our school, serving the same complexity of need, being expected to deliver the same quality of experience. So it's essential that government addresses the cost of education crisis that is seeing school budgets being squeezed to the point of being unable to meet need. However, establishing a national funding system that doesn't compel schools to catastrophise children to secure higher funding levels, that doesn't disincentivise the reporting of progress in fear of seeing funding reduce, that reduces volatility of funding across the budgetary cycle and which secures sufficient financial capacity to ensure that the children's requirements are met effectively, will be really complicated. And the past experience of governmental responses to complex implementational issues around SEND doesn't fill me with huge amounts of confidence that they'll get this right first time. They're also right to be looking at the complexity threshold within mainstream. That needs to be raised. What we're seeing is increasing numbers of children being educated out of the mainstream. But that needs to be achieved through a combination of investment and support, including ensuring that the system recognises the value of inclusivity and actively rewards it. I think that the idea of setting out what we should be able to reasonably expect from schools in the different parts of the system is a positive step, along with building better local partnerships towards a system where a community of schools serves a community of children, a less fragmented system where it's harder to abdicate that collective responsibility that we hold. But this will need significant investment in professional understanding. We desperately need to increase the level of SEND expertise within schools, starting with much more consistent quality and quantity of SEND input within initial teacher education, followed by the prioritisation of SEND-related CPD post-qualification. It will also require an increase in capacity of local support systems that have been eroded so catastrophically over the 10 years when we've seen local authorities, critically underfunded in so many ways. And we also seem to see the development of suitable spaces and the provision of necessary resources. I think it's easy sometimes to fall into the trap that solving some of the challenges with the SEND system about creating more places and more spaces. But rooms don't educate children, it's people that educate children. And that's where we need to make sure that we're really investing our energies in terms of developing the institutional capacity of the educational system. But this focus on the process is also the Green Paper's limitation. There's little social ambition. There is limited stated intent to change the lived experiences of children and families beyond the involvement of statutory services. And yet that is also where so much work needs to be done. If you take chapter 3, for example, excellent provision from early years to adulthood, it does very little to address the beyond system factors which impact on the extent to which people with learning disabilities go on to live rich and fulfilling lives. We talk of preparation for adulthood for students, but we do little to address the challenges of a society often poorly prepared or equipped to support people with additionality. So if we take the Institute of Health Equities report, A Fair Supportive Society, a document that I hold very dear and it influences an awful lot of my thinking about the school in which I work, it's missing from the Green Paper's references, which I was quite surprised about, because their investigation into the life outcomes of people with learning disabilities gives us the data that we should be looking to affect change to. This is our rationale. We need to address the 15 to 20 years premature death, the 50% increased risk of living in a damp bedroom and twice as likely to live in housing that is too cold in winter, even prior to the current cost of living crisis, the 50% that are experiencing chronic loneliness, the 94% unemployment rate of those with learning disabilities who are known to their local authority. This is to name just a few of the metrics that reflect lives less well lived than they could be. This requires us to improve the interface between public services and the charitable and private sectors. It requires us to find better ways to articulate the capability of young people with SEND. It requires us to support those less familiar with the children we work with to see the potential rather than just the complexity. And it requires us to support society to become more effective at embracing difference rather than holding it at arm's length. Within the context of SEND, systemic responsibility may end at 25, but social responsibility doesn't. We can address the dysfunctionality of the system, but if we don't also address the failings of society, then we're only walking part of the path. So for me, the SEND Green Paper has recognised the fragility of the foundations of the system, but hasn't looked to build beyond them. they might have identified many of the key issues in the prologue, but they failed to begin to even write the book. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks very much, Simon. I'm going to move on to Tanya. As I said, is the co-founder of the Special Needs Jungle, which is one of the best resources out there for parents and anybody else who is interested in SEND. You may want to say a few more words of introduction yourself and then give us your 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, my name's Tanya Tirraoro. I founded Special Needs Jungle back in 2008, so was involved in the previous reforms as well, with the parent care reform. I started it as a parent. I have 2 adults now. They were children at the time with autism. I also have an autism diagnosis myself. So I come at it from the angle of very much as a parent of children, and as the parent of a child or a young person who has been to university twice. The last pandemic, the last one did for her. She's now at home, no future to speak of, extremely bright, autistic. What does this do for her? Nothing. But really, when you have to ask, what was this designed to do? Was it designed to do a root and branch change? Was it designed to tinker around the edges? And I think in the end, it designs to do, it succeeds in doing neither. It does talk about legislation change, but we don't know where those legislation changes would come. Would it come within the Children and Families Act? Would it be a standalone piece of legislation? None of these questions are satisfactorily answered. And the consultation itself leaves a massive amount to be desired. So just something that we were discussing before we came on is the continuing lack of an accessible version. And we really do think that the consultation needs to be extended. So for us, we've been writing a whole series of blogs. I hope you've managed to see some of them, and trying to simplify the questions so that if you want to just answer one, you can do that on the website and we will put those answers forward. But for us, it's more about what is missing. I mean, what is in there, like the local partnerships, the national SEND system, nobody asked for that. You know, there's a whole lot of stuff in there that I don't think anybody would have put in their 2019 responses to when the SEND review was announced. And there's a whole load of stuff in there that's not in there that everybody was asking for, such as a greater focus on SEND support. Nothing in there really about the graduated response and how children can be helped at an earlier stage. It talks about early intervention, but it talks about it in the context of alternative provision. I don't call that early intervention. I call that really, really late intervention, because if you're only looking to help a child when they're on their way out of the door, you've effectively failed. And as we know, so many of those children who are excluded or who are moved to alternative provision have undiagnosed or unassessed SEND. Those things need to happen at a much earlier stage, not when they're first getting to alternative provision. It discusses people, practitioners from alternative provision going into schools to give their advice. Now, we used to have that. It was called outreach. We used to have a lot more of it, and it really used to, my children benefited from speech and language outreach, from autism outreach. It's why I knew the support that they needed to have, and so I was able to get it for them. It talks about national standards, but don't we already have the Children and Families Act and the Equality Act? Those are national standards. Yet, okay, the regulations could be tightened up, but we have national standards. Local authorities don't seem to be able to abide by the law. What makes them think that they're going to abide by any other national standards that are statutory or not statutory? None of this within the Green Paper explains what went wrong last time and how they're going to make sure they don't go wrong this time. Mandatory mediation they're talking about. Mediation doesn't work half the time because local authorities won't engage in it. I've heard that they're bringing lawyers to some, which is completely contrary to the spirit of mediation. And it will only make it more difficult for children to get the support they need by pushing things further down the road and making things more difficult. It misses out how they're going to effect culture change, how they're going to make those people in local authorities not turn down children at every assessment request, so that they end up going to tribunal where they are then forced to assess, or how they're going to make teachers indeed teachers of SEND. There is in the code of practice, it talks about every teacher is a teacher of SEND, but it doesn't say that in the initial teacher training core framework. So how are teachers supposed to be teachers of SEND? They've got absolutely no chance. So they rolled out on their first day of school like rabbits in the headlights, expected to support all these children who don't have the training to do it. I mean, who would be a teacher these days under those circumstances? That's what really needs to be focused on at the very start, to give people the skills they need to help children at an early stage. It also claims to promote an inclusive single system, but I don't call a system of mainstream special schools and alternative provision inclusive. I call that a 3-tier system. So if you want more children in mainstream, make it happen by putting the investment into buildings, into accessible buildings, into teacher training, into knowledge, and just to make sure that those children can stay in mainstream. With that, my children would probably have been able to stay within mainstream, but they couldn't because there wasn't the understanding and there wasn't the expertise that they needed. Limiting parental choice to a tailored list. Who's devising this tailored list? And what if none of those schools on this tailored list are suitable? What happens then? Oh yes, that's when you go to mandatory mediation. And if it doesn't work, then that's when you go back to another review panel. It just seems to be this all completely designed with making families' lives more difficult. And one final thing is the school's white paper discussed racial equality and putting that at the door of the SEND review. We took us a huge amount of time, but we prepared a report for the Department for Education about race and SEND, which they snatched out of our hands gleefully. Thank you very much. We will be using this. Nothing about it in the green paper whatsoever. And if you don't recognize the intersectionality of SEND and race, of SEND, of disadvantage and poverty, you're not tackling the issues in front of you. So I'd like to know, really and this is going to be another 2 years down the line by the time we get through to any of these changes. What can be done now? What can the DFE do now that doesn't include a whole load of new research when there's tons of research there already? They're just not looking at it. So what can we do now? And that's what I'd like to know, and that's where I'm going to finish. Bit of a rant, sorry.
Thank you very much. Rants are always welcome. There was actually loads and loads in there that I want to come back on, and I'm sure lots of people who are listening in will want to come back on as well to ask more about. I'm going to go to our last panelist, Daniel Upfield, to give us the perspective of a mainstream head teacher on the green paper, head teacher at Ark Swift. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. So as Sam says, I'm going to try and come at this from the perspective of being a mainstream head and obviously having had experience of working with SEND for a number of years as well. So first off, just going to start with the point there that it's taken a long time to get to this position, hasn't it? Obviously, the review was launched back in 2019, and it's taken 3 years to get to this point. And obviously, that the full implementation of the green paper is still some way off. I think one of my first areas of caution really is the fact that there is a clear inference in the green paper that schools haven't been doing enough for children with SEND. But obviously already mainstream and special schools alike are working incredibly hard to support the needs of all children. And the overwhelming majority already have a highly inclusive culture, are already trying to support children to do the best to their abilities, and putting in that additional support where it's needed. However, I think what we're lacking is the resources to be able to do this effectively. So it's not so much one of culture, but perhaps one of a sort of persistent lack of funding from government to be able to implement what we need to within school. I think each year, more and more of the resources are being concentrated at the statutory end of the system. So there's less money to support the early intervention. And what we're seeing is a further demand for the statutory intervention being generated. So we're in a vicious cycle where the funding is directed at the latter stages. And certainly for us being in a mainstream school, this can lead to a large proportion of high needs children in mainstream. But despite the best efforts, sometimes the education can risk becoming exclusive for those children rather than inclusive in our mainstream setting. As Simon has rightly said, specialist settings are frequently full, and it can be very difficult to get the places or the support from them. And we end up as a school in a back and forth wrangling with the local authority as to who's paying for what and where. I mean, we're currently working with some fantastic autism outreach support, and Tanya's referenced the quality of outreach as being important already. But for example, that kind of service has taken 9 months of this year to support those 5 or 6 children who've arrived in our early years who really kind of need that urgent support. It's interesting that the government talks in its terminology about getting 90%, this is referring to the white paper, of children to the expected standard in reading, writing and maths. Now that refers to all children as being the same homogeneous maths, and that actually not being seen as unique individuals. And the fact that any child who falls behind in English and maths is going to be guaranteed support, whether they've got SEND or not. And obviously that should be welcomed, and the money going directly to schools. But what's really important is that the government understands that some pupils who have SEND will always be working at a different level. Yes, obviously they deserve and they should get the extra support, but they shouldn't be using the phrase fallen behind for those children. I think it's very sensible that the proposal is not to abandon EHCPs. I think a standardized template and digitizing those and making the whole process more straightforward, I think is certainly something to be welcomed, as is the better identification of SEND in the early years. I think we're finding more and more the level of need that's coming into our early years at primary stage is becoming more and more, and that real importance of upskilling early years practitioners in being able to undertake the 2-year-old check, and that close working between education and between health. Touching back on alternative provision again, I think as a school, when I first joined here at Ark Swift a few years ago, we had a very high suspension rate. There was a large number of children that were being suspended or excluded on a regular basis, and we've now got to a position where that's practically eradicated and changing the culture of the school. But I think that support from alternative provision and that outreach in enabling us to do that was incredibly important. And as a mainstream school, being able to access the right support as and when we need it is obviously critical. I think currently there's definitely some inequality with accessing therapeutic services, for example, speech and language therapy, mental health support. And I think some of the proposals to strengthen accountability between health and education, I think hopefully will boost sort of parent and carer confidence. I think at the moment, delivering a truly inclusive system, I think there does need to be some further thought around the wider framework in which we operate, because the rigid mainstream curriculum and the progress measures that we are assessed against for children who have SEN and disabilities, that penalises those schools that are being as inclusive as they possibly can. And the SEND Green Paper and the Schools White Paper haven't actually addressed that issue in terms of progress measures for schools. And I think also the other critical thing that's missing in the Green Paper as well is the issue around funding and when a school gets top up. So obviously, as a school, we have that threshold of £6,000 that we're expected to use from our own budget on top of the standard place funding. But that figure goes back to 2009, and it hasn't changed since 2009. So there's no inflation on that, and obviously it should be much more if it had kept up with inflation. And I think that that's not fit for purpose, and that's not been addressed in the Green Paper at all. I think this has been touched upon by other panelists already, but increasing the knowledge and confidence of the workforce is vital to empowering teachers. And that whole every teacher a teacher of SEND starts with that quality of initial teacher training, and that actually we're equipping our trainees to be a teacher of learners with SEND right from the start of their career, and then that training goes all the way through. I think that's critically important. And also that same high quality of training for those who are working in early years settings as well. And certainly I welcome the Senko Award for early years. I think is something that would be very helpful. And I think particularly the early years, thinking about the impact of the pandemic as well, the delays in speech and language, personal social development, physical development, particularly of the most disadvantaged, I think that's going to become more of an issue for those youngest children joining our settings. Yes, there is some concerns around some of the terminology that's used. Have to be careful with the phrase leveled up, which the government love to use in lots of documentation, and what that actually means. But obviously, there is an emphasis on interagency working and some form of continuum of provision. So hopefully there are some steps that are in the right direction.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And thanks to all the panelists for some really valuable initial input. I guess before, we've already got some great questions coming into the chat. Please do keep adding to those questions. If you've got something you want to ask, you can specify to a particular member of the panel, or you can just ask a question generally, and I can put it to one or more of them. I wanted to ask about money, because it feels like money is the kind of, you've all mentioned it in different ways, but money feels like it's the underlying driver of a lot of what's in this Green Paper, in that the system has increased in cost by 40% over the last 3 years. I think whichever government we had in power would probably be starting to panic at those kinds of numbers and thinking, how do we manage these costs in the future? And it feels like that's then led to a lot of the sort of changes and ideas that are proposed in the paper. Do you accept it's a real problem? Do you think we should actually just be putting a lot more money into the system? And if you do think it's a real problem, how would you sort of got a different way about trying to solve it, given that you've all been fairly critical of the paper itself? And I'm going to start with Simon on that one.
No vested interest as a head teacher who's critically underfunded even by national objective measures of what funding should be. I suppose there's two bits. One is what should it increase by? Because we talk about the increase, but we don't also talk about the restraint that the school sector has experienced. So what would be a reasonable increase over the course of that period of time? I once did a comparison between my 2010 budget. I wasn't actually head teacher back then, but I had access to it, and my 2020 budget. My total per pupil funding had increased by 0.6%. Now, if you look at the cumulative impact of inflation, what do you reckon over 10 years? 30%, maybe? So there's been this artificial constraint of expenditure within the specialist sector. So there is maybe an aspect of us needing to understand what the reality of kind of cost should be. But I do think there's a massive disconnect between what government perceives to be a reasonable financial settlement and what it actually costs to be able to meet the requirements of the children that we're working with. And we see this disconnect in all sorts of different things in the specialist sector. We're rarely included in the algorithms that allocate funding for things like the teachers' pay and pensions, remuneration. You look at things like National Tutoring Programme, which is an absolute car crash of a policy when you look at the specialist sector. Many special schools just will not touch that money because of the way that it's been controlled. Yet that money is in our budget, and that money will show potentially as an underspend at the end of the year because it isn't there, and we give them back. In terms of the broader picture, I think one of the challenges that we need to understand is how the economics of the SEND system are forcing expenditure into certain places. And whilst I respect and value so much of the work that happens outside of the state-maintained sector, I do worry that a supply and demand issue is resulting in high cost but low complexity places outside of the maintained system. But how we actually resolve that is massively complicated, and it's barely even medium term, let alone short term, because you're going to have to ensure that you build cumulative capacity through the system, starting with things with supporting initial teacher education, and then building, expertise within mainstream to raise that complexity threshold, to reduce the legitimate need for specialist provision, and ensure that mainstream schools can support a higher level of complexity within the context of what is reasonable. So I suppose, to conclude, for me, is that we won't really know what we should be spending until we get the policies right. If we get the policies right, then expenditure might settle at a point that is reasonable. But at the moment, the policies are all wrong, and that's resulting in poor use of public money to resolve problems that are not the creation of the budget holders. So I have no idea how this will pan out. I have how long it will take, but unless we get this consultation right, unless we get public policy right, we'll never have any idea whether we're spending the right amount of money in the right way.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, that we always start from the baseline and we see it going up and we start to worry, but if we haven't thought about why the baseline should be what it is, then it won't necessarily get us very far. Tanya, what's your sort of view on the sort of financial question? And particularly, you talked a lot about the frustration that parents have with local authorities, which is absolutely true whenever you talk to sort of parents about this issue. Is money the issue there, or is there something else that's going on with the way that that they're treating parents?
Well, I think, the previous reforms cost about £700 million. It wasn't accounted for. Nobody really knows where half of it went. Just ask, you only have to read Matt Keir's articles on special needs jungle. He's our real funding expert. So, but they hit just as austerity was starting to bite. And so a lot of that money went probably elsewhere within local authorities, just in the same way that the money that was put in for CAMS within health service never really reached the people that it was supposed to reach. So we need more accountability for whatever funding is out there. We need, recently the DfE has told local authorities, you can have this money, but you tell us what you want to spend it on. And there was just something that came out the other week that said special schools haven't had a lot of the funding that they were supposed to have had. And yet at a conference last week, the DfE, speaking to many school teachers, said, well, we've increased SEND funding by 40% in the last 10 years, which led to a number of teachers saying, well, actually, my school hasn't had any, neither has my school. Where's it gone? So there is this whole disconnect of the DfE thinking they are pumping money in, and schools saying, we haven't got it. Where is it going? And I know DfE, that's a you problem. You need to know where that money is going. And so if councils were funded properly, so that they weren't looking at the SEND budget enviously, then maybe that they will be more likely to comply with the law existing to ensure that children get the support they need. I can't speak to schools funding. I don't know anything about it. That you have two people there who can tell you everything you need to know in that area. But I just know that historically money was not going where it was supposed to be going. So that needs to be accounted for. And again, yes, you need to move it so that children are getting the support earlier on. That's £6,000, quite right. It needs to be increased so that it can actually have a positive impact on children at an earlier stage. And I just don't understand why they haven't done that. Why are they throwing money at, millions of pounds for infrastructure, millions of pounds for that, but they're not getting the basics right of supporting children at an early stage.
Thanks very much. And I think the sort of point about accountability and transparency is critical. It's clear that the DfE is very frustrated about sort of the inability to get a sense of what's going on at the local level. Whether the proposals in the green paper fix that, who knows? Daniel, so coming to you on this sort of question of money, as a mainstream sort of head teacher, you mentioned the fact that sort of the underlying amount hasn't risen since 2009. Do you feel that anything in the green paper as it is going to reduce costs, or is it going to make your life even harder and more expensive?
I think one of the interesting things in the Green Paper is the proposals around the banding system. Obviously, the banding system is looking to have a sort of a national tariffs included. However, I do feel that an inflexible banding system may end up causing more problems than it's set out to do. I mean, provision of costs would be different in a central London school like ours. Maybe it might be different in different parts of the country. So actually, do the DfE take that variable factor into account when they're looking at the banding system as part of the SEN reform?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think again, I mean, it feels to me like this is one of the things that's in there to control costs, but until we see the detail, it's hard to know exactly what that's going to look like. We've got loads of great questions coming in on the chat, which I want to make sure we get to as many of these as possible. So I'm going to start asking some of these. We've got a question from Ben P, which is a really interesting one. Does the panel feel that the push for general academisation, obviously a big theme of the white paper, is going to successfully enhance an inclusive approach or create a greater diversity in terms of provision, some good, some bad, especially given that much of the current guidance does not apply in full to these settings and will need addressing to limit the growth of unlawful exclusion and off-rolling, etc. As an academy head, Daniel, I'll start with you on this one. Do you think that kind of push towards academisation is going to be helpful?
I would say I do wonder if the push to academisation actually, if arguing about structural changes, is an unnecessary distraction, given the pressure that's already facing schools and the work we're trying to do with SEND. Being part of a multi-academy trust, obviously I see the benefits of working within an academy trust, particularly where there is one with a strong direction on SEND. However, I don't know whether forced academisation is something that people should be directing their attention and energies to when there's much more important things to be doing in terms of the SEND.
I'm going to direct these questions at one of the panel initially, just because we've got so many and I want to make sure we get through all of them. If one of the other panelists would like to say something, please just jump in, Simon or Tanya, on this one.
Yeah, I think that there is a key point about the academisation thing. I agree with Daniel. I think it's a distraction. But for me, as a community special school, my catchment is about 23 miles long and about 10 miles wide. And there are innumerable different school structures within that catchment area. And currently, as a maintained special school, I sort of sit alongside them and outside of them. I work for the local authority. Essentially, they deal with all of our kind of bits and pieces. I worry that if I ended up being part of an academy trust, the temptation would be to drive that support that we can offer into the academy trust at the expense of those schools that are not part of that particular trust or are not part of any trust at all. And so, you know, if we end up going down the route of compelling academisation, there are plenty of soft levers that are started to be used to draw schools in that direction. I'm looking at USIF funding and reduction in local authority capital expenditure. You know, is that we need to understand what the threats might be. At the moment, it's an aspiration that seems built on political ideology rather than pragmatically improving pupil outcomes.
Thanks very much, Simon.
So I just agree with what Simon and Daniel, who would know far more about this than myself. Just as far as the Green Paper goes, it just seems to be making it easier for mainstream academies, clearly not Daniel's, but some of them, to shunt those troublesome children down to the alternative provision that's within their own academy. It doesn't seem to be a great idea, and I don't think that the evidence supports academies improve outcomes, certainly not for children with SEND.
So we don't think it's going to make much of a difference to this issue, I think, is a general consensus. We've got a question here I wanted to come to Tanya on from Louise Chong. It's sort of she's talking about accountability, which is something you talked about a lot in your initial comments. She says there needs to be real penalties levelled at those who break the law. I presume she means local authorities. If the penalty is sufficiently punitive, it should hopefully reduce tribunals and the us and them scenario. Do you think that's a sort of realistic way of going about it? Do you think that would improve the position for parents?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, if they're fined, where does the money go, and where does the money come from? Local authorities don't have a lot of money, and if it's going to end up coming from another part of the education budget, then I'm not sure how helpful that is. Although I agree that there needs to be more, stiff penalties. But that's the question, is it? How do you hold them to account? You can't force them to sack people, because it's to do with the entire culture of the local authority. But what I can tell you is that I don't think anything really in this green paper is going to make things better in that respect. It doesn't seem to be aimed at increasing accountability that a parent would want.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's a mechanism in theory via these national standards and this national delivery board, and the sort of fact that these local plans have to go up to that level, that there might be, through that, we don't know, might be a mechanism of accountability whereby they could, intervene and take control of an area, I suppose, in extreme circumstances, if they felt that they weren't meeting the standards properly. But it's all very unclear at the moment what that might involve.
But who would take control, and where would,
I think
those people? I mean, just look at the SEND advisors that they are hiring. So many of them are from failed local authorities.
I mean, I think this is exactly challenging. If you're going to nationalize the sort of things, then you have to create the capability, and where's that capability going to come from? That's probably my single biggest question about the whole green paper. We've got a question for Simon from John Clawton. He says, you talked of a community of schools. How would that work most effectively?
Blimey. Yeah, that's dangerous saying things, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. I think you need to probably come up with some sort of nationally agreed structure for outreach from the specialist sector into mainstream. So you start to build knowledge exchange. That needs to be a system that isn't driven by the creation of evidence for moving children out of the mainstream, but based on building expertise within the mainstream system. You also need to get some in-reach, so that children that are in special schools can benefit from the best of mainstream practice, particularly when they have expertise in particular subjects that are beyond our ability to meet within the curriculum, and also in-reach back into specialist sector, where we can work to maybe address some of the foundational skills that sometimes mainstream schools don't have as well detailed an understanding of, particularly around the pre-formative skills necessary for reading and writing and numeracy, where we can, as I say this with all humility, take pretty much any learning objective back down to point of birth by deconstructing learning. One of the reasons for that is just we're not tied to a chronological curriculum. We work purely on a developmental basis, which is one of the joys of working in the specialist sector, one of the true freedoms. You need to address the consequences of data associated with children operating at a level that is below chronological expectations. I think there is a punitive culture directed towards both children and schools where this is concerned. We seem obsessed with this idea of getting everyone to the same point. And whilst I'd be really worried about doing anything that would lower expectations around children with SEND, because there is already a systemically, problematic position of low expectations within society, we do need to understand that sometimes people reach the same point at different points in their lives. And at the moment, the education system isn't really geared up as well as it could be for that. Partnership between the specialist and mainstream sectors might be able to do that. One of the key ones would be to introduce inclusion nurseries that can be accessed without requiring the HCP. So if a health visitor or a parent or other professional notices that something isn't going quite according to plan, that they can get access to suitable specialist support pre-statutory school age, so that we don't start addressing or perceiving things to be a remediation, this kind of idea that your child is not at a point they should be. Your child is at the point they are at, and that is what we need to address. It isn't about comparators all the time, but dealing with that early on so that we don't end up having to deal with a more significant challenge later on. Unfortunately, we see most of our kids come to us, they either have very complex needs at the point of entry in year sort of N2, N1, which is pre-statutory school age, or they come to us as a result of breakdown in placement in mainstream. And the damage that breakdown in placement does to a child and its family is absolutely disastrous. So anything we can do to enable kids to succeed in the first instance, rather than needing to fail to access what they require, should be sorted out. Inclusion is a collective endeavour. So our school, every single child up to the age of 16 spends half a day a week in mainstream. I don't know many special schools that do that. That's about building relationships with schools across the entire education system and empowering them to understand the value of difference within their community. So that's probably the main ones. Sorry, that was a bit off the top of my head, Sam.
Well,
Can I just ask Simon, actually? I think it's a great idea that they use that, you know, specialist teachers can go in from special schools and from AP can go into mainstream to use their expertise. But how is that funded? I mean, presumably because you're taking a teacher away that would normally be teaching in their own school.
So historically, the way that it used to be done in Oxfordshire was that we would get an additional planned place put into our budget to compensate for the loss of that teacher. We'd build an extra bit of capacity in the system. That was withdrawn some time ago. It's probably one of the most foolish financial decisions, because in terms of total cost, it was very, very small. In terms of total impact, it was very, very high. What you need to do is probably work on a commissioning basis and look to see what they thought the local aggregated need would be within the local area. You then work with your special schools and work out what additional teaching capacity you would require to be able to deliver that additional support. Now for us, it's actually fairly straightforward. The cost is there, that cost has to be met. I'm not prepared to use the small amounts of money that I get to meet the requirements of the children in my school to support children that aren't even on my roll. I think that's morally right. But we have plenty of staff who work part-time who would be very happy to pick up an extra day a week here and there, you know, to go into other schools, share their expertise, share their passion, share their knowledge and their vision. But as I said earlier, that this has absolutely got to be on the basis of raising the complexity threshold in mainstream. It cannot be used purely to build evidence bases for removing children from the mainstream system. And historically, outreach has too often been about that. School has reached crisis. They want the child to leave. Let's get someone in to tell us what the evidence is that, you know, we can use to then get that child to another setting. This has got to be about raising expectations within the system more broadly.
Thank you very much. I mean, we've often talked as well in the past about sort of lack of proper English teacher training provision for special schools as well.
Just to come in on the initial teacher training there. So the initial teacher trainees that we work with here, we've got some really good partnerships where they go out and have an alternative placement in a local non-mainstream school. And I think that's an incredibly valuable part of their training, that our mainstream trainees spend some time in a special school and have a really good sort of a good understanding of what that constitutes. So that for me is a really important part of the initial teacher training that we offer. Obviously, we could always do more. And I think also in terms of those partnerships as well, really thinking in the early years about that effective working with education and health, particularly for those children who sort of, as they're coming up to their 2-year-old check, I think actually capturing that earlier and making sure we've got that early intervention there. So coming back to your question about local partnerships, I think, yes, the initial teacher training and that close working with health and education in the earliest years.
Thank you to everybody. We've got a question here from Leila McTavish, if I've pronounced that right, which I think is a really important one. What do the panelists see as the highest impact input in terms of teaching strategies for new teachers? Daniel, do you want to have a go at that one?
Teaching strategies. I think it really comes back to the question that I was answering previously there, making sure that as part of their initial teacher training, that all teachers understand that every teacher is a teacher of SEND, because actually they need at that earlier stage to create that culture of inclusion. And the fact that if we can empower those teachers and we can give them that breadth of knowledge and it's confidence, really, can we give the confidence to our workforce that they believe that they can meet the needs of those children with SEND? So I think that initial teacher training, but also then maintaining that all the way through. It's not just about initial teacher training, it's our continuous professional development that we're offering to our teachers. What aspects of SEND are covered on an annual basis, teachers understanding the whole graduated response and the cycle of how we plan and do and review for SEND.
Anyone else want to come in on that one?
I think for me, one of the most powerful things to do would be to try and move away from an approach that sees us trying to impact on the outcome that we're not seeing, rather than impact on the cause of that outcome not being achieved in the first place. So child struggling with phonics, we do more phonics, but we don't necessarily address whether it's a visual perceptive issue, an auditory processing issue, a temporal sequencing issue, a shape recognition issue, or a motor control. Could be all sorts of many things. One of the aspects of our curriculum is that we have an entire section called intellectual and reasoning skills, which are all the prerequisite skills that children often use learn intuitively prior to entering the education system. But so often deficits within them can have a material impact on learning things that we would expect children to be able to do at certain ages. It's a real challenge, and initial teacher education, does it really well in some areas, does it really badly in others? I spend too much time working with NQTs who are poorly prepared, and Tanya was saying about this earlier, and Daniel's implied the same thing, is that it's great if they've heard about the Salamanca Statement, it's great if they understand about the United Nations right to the child, but if they cannot be inclusive in the classroom because no one's given them the practical skills to be able to differentiate appropriately or adapt learning effectively, then actually that theoretical stuff, that philosophical stuff is being lost. And what we've got is a system where we're expecting teachers to be able to be held accountable in the same kind of ways, work with children in the same kind of ways, but we're not preparing them in the same kind of ways. There is a huge diversity of quality and quantity when it comes to SEND and initial teacher education. And that's something that has always been in the gift of the system to resolve, and the system has chosen not to resolve it. And now it's time that that's sorted out.
Yeah, completely.
I think that one of the biggest things a teacher can do is have the confidence to say, I don't know what the issue is with this child. I think we need to get the educational psychologist, or this is my hunch. Let's get somebody in who understands, so we can put the right support in at an early stage. It's fine doing your assess plan, do review, but if you're putting the wrong plan in place, it's not going to work. So they need to be given the confidence, and schools need to have the budgets to be able to get those expertise, as it says in the SEND Code of Practice, which has been there since 2014. But schools haven't got the money to do it, I'm told. Some are given quotas. Well, you've had your fill of educational psychologists for this term. You can't have any more. But really, that's where the earliest intervention, and in preschool as well. And yeah, I think that the extra training for early years in SEND is absolutely crucial, as long as it carries over as soon as they get into reception, that it's not just, oh well, they've had that now, let's just carry on. So yeah, giving them the confidence, giving them the tools that they need, so that we can really make a difference at this early stage.
Absolutely. I'm going to go to a question from Jane Nolan. This is a big one. The green paper is a missed opportunity for a real rethink of the system. I think that's been a common theme of both your comments and the comments in the chat. What's the one radical change the panel would like to see to improve outcomes for children with SEND? I assume there's more than one radical change that you would all want, but if you could do one thing, if you had one thing that you could change about this green paper, or one thing you could do as Secretary of State, what would it be?
I mean, I think for me, it would be local authorities actually complying with their current statutory obligations. I don't know if that's in the Educational Secretary's gift, but I think that local authorities seem to think that if they did that, then they would be creating a massive amount of EHCPs, but that's wrong. What they would be doing is helping children at a much earlier stage, and therefore avoiding the need for loads of EHCPs. So if I could do one thing, it would be what we've just discussed, getting that support in early, not at AP, not when they're in the year 7 and deciding that actually they can't read, but early, and making local authorities understand that getting that support in early is not going to be creating more EHCPs. It's the opposite.
Daniel?
I would say getting into a position where local authorities are not wasting huge amounts of money on SEND tribunals. It really links to what Tanya's saying there about early support, and not getting to the stage where parents are going to the tribunal due to EHCPs and placement, but a huge millions of pounds since 2014 has been wasted on tribunals. And if that money could be better invested in early intervention and support further on, I think that would make a huge difference.
I think what I'd probably do is look at the equality impact assessment process, which is designed to ensure that policy doesn't disproportionately disadvantage any one particular group. What I'd like to see is an approach that requires every single education policy to be evaluated to establish whether it materially advantages those with SEND, particularly those with learning disability, because the entire system structurally disadvantages them. So if we continue to make policy on the basis of trying to do no more harm, I'm not convinced that we're actually going to do the good that we need to do.
That's a really
Actually, there isn't. I haven't seen an equality impact assessment on the green paper because there isn't one.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I think the more I talk to people who have a lot more expertise in the issue than I do, the more I get the sense that we have such an impoverished idea about what expectations means in the way we think about education, the way the DfE thinks about education, that they almost can't do what you're saying, Simon, because they wouldn't know what that looked like. There's no language for doing what you're talking about. You know, there's a system for children, and then there's SEND children who they have to sort of find a way to fit into the system rather than what you're talking about, which is what would actually make things better. But it comes from, as you were saying at the start, that kind of wider social difficulty we have with defining what we mean by expectations. So,
but also look at who you've got within the DfE. You know, it's these bright young things who turn up with no experience or lived experience or maybe family experience of SEND, and they take lots of notes. It's very good. You know, I've been there umpteen meetings and so on where they do this and they go away and for some reason it gets twisted into some weird policy like national standards, so which says that they might sympathize, but they certainly don't empathize or understand what has to be done. So the DfE needs to look at itself and make sure that it reflects the people that they're trying to help.
Absolutely. I mean, I think so. There's a lot of comments from Ken Upton, sort of making similar points in the chat about sort of who do the DfE think is, as you were saying sort of earlier, Tanya, who's going to be actually managing these national standards? Who's going to be implementing them when we have exactly this issue that the people within the DfE don't actually have this sort of knowledge or expertise? Where are they? I want to know who they're going to get to run the SEND delivery board.
But it's the DfE, isn't it? And the DfE get it wrong, who's going to be checking their work?
Yes, well,
the DfE. That's
we have a question from Lucy James. Mainstream schools vary enormously in their levels of inclusivity and outcomes for SEND children. What in the green paper can be used to hold these schools, especially in maths, I think it goes beyond maths, to account in terms of meeting those needs? What is needed to help those schools focus on optimal outcomes for SEND children without resorting to off-rolling AP? Daniel, what do you think is what's needed to make that happen?
I think it's. Can I just take a think about that question? I'll come back to me in just a moment, Sam. I'm just going to formulate my answer to that, if I may.
Well, I've actually just noticed that I'm getting so into this conversation because it's so interesting that we're actually almost out of time. And I thought we had loads of time left because we've been enjoying the conversation so much. So I'm probably going to have to draw us to a close, in fact. And there's so many questions that we haven't got to yet, which is a real shame because there's loads of interesting stuff in there. But I think we have got through an awful lot in this session. We haven't even talked at all about AP, which is a sort of whole other area of the green paper, which is sort of, I think, really interesting too. But maybe we'll have to do that in another session. So I would like to take the opportunity to say thank you enormously to our panel and to apologise profusely for my unprofessional faffing around at the beginning, to Simon Knight, to Tanya Tiraro and to Daniel Upfield for fantastic contributions. We are recording this session. It's going to be available on the ArkTalks section of the website in the next few days for those of you who want to have a look at it or pass it on to anybody else who you think might be interested. We will be having the next ArkTalks session. I don't think we have a date yet, but it will be on extracurricular support in schools and what schools are doing around that. So look forward to that one. Please join us again for that one. But in the meantime, an enormous thanks to everyone who wrote fantastic questions in the comments and to all of our panelists.